Good afternoon. I'd like to make some comments on three things. First, the government's declaration of Mr. Wei Zhou as persona non grata. Secondly, the vote that just took place in the House of Commons on the motion that had the 4 calls to action. And third, the Speaker's ruling on a prima facie case. So regarding the government's decision to declare Mr. Wei Zhou persona non grata, I have to say this: it shouldn't have taken this long. It shouldn't have taken 2 years for the government to make this decision when they became aware that members and their families of the House of Commons were being targeted by the PRC and by persons in Canada accredited by the Government of Canada as diplomats in Canada. It shouldn't have taken the targeting of a member of Parliament to make this decision. We have known for years that the PRC is using its accredited diplomats here in Canada to target Canadians and their families. We all know about the case of the University of Toronto Scarborough student who won election to student council, who stood up for the human rights of Tibetans, and was targeted by action coordinated through the PRC consulate in Toronto. We all know of the case of the McMaster University student who stood up and talked about the rights of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in the PRC, and who was targeted through coordinated action by diplomats accredited here in Canada. We all know of the case of the PRC in Vancouver interfering in the diaspora community in the Lower Mainland. So it shouldn't have taken the fact that a member of Parliament and their family was being targeted by the PRC here in Canada for the government to have taken action on this. This should have happened years ago. I hope that this makes it clear to not just the PRC, but other authoritarian states who have representation here in Canada, that this crossing the line of diplomacy into foreign interference threat activities is utterly unacceptable here on Canadian soil. Regarding the motion that just was adopted by the House of Commons, again, it's inexplicable why the government didn't support the motion. The motion had 4 calls to action. One was to declare this diplomat persona non grata. The second was to establish a public inquiry. The third was to shut down the illegal police stations. And the fourth call to action was the decision was the need to implement a foreign agents registry. So again, it's inexplicable why the government isn't supporting the 3 other elements of this motion. Again, security experts have been telling us for years that there isn't one single tool to combat foreign interference threat activities here on Canadian soil. Expelling diplomats who are engaged in those activities is but one tool. There are other tools that need to be put in place. So it's inexplicable why the government is refusing to support a motion calling on the adoption of 3 other measures to help protect Canadians here on Canadian soil. And finally, on the Speaker's ruling to find a prima facie case of interference, I'll say this. It's clear in recent years that the Government of Canada hasn't stepped up to protect Canadians and to protect democratic institutions against foreign interference threat activities. The wisdom of our constitutional structure is that the executive branch of government, when it fails, is not the only place in our system where the rights of members and their families can be protected. And so Parliament is now going to undertake its own decision on how to protect members and their families from these foreign interference threat activities. So I look forward to the vote in the House on the motion I moved to send this to Procedure and House Affairs Committee. I hope it gets adopted by the House, and when it does, I look forward to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee's study and report on this so that we can better protect our democratic institutions in a way that the Government of Canada is failing to do. Thank you.
Chong, avez-vous l'impression, d'une certaine façon, que c'est une victoire pour vous?
Je pense que ce n'est pas une victoire, pas pour moi seulement, c'est une victoire pour tous les Canadiens qui ont des victimes de l'ingérence étrangère pendant 5 ans, pendant 10 ans, qui est les sujets d'une menace des régimes autoritariens comme l'Iran, comme le gouvernement de Pékin, qui ont des histoires silencieuses, qui n'ont pas des actions du gouvernement du Canada pour protéger leurs droits ici à la terrain canadien. Donc, j'espère que cette décision le gouvernement aujourd'hui donne un message clair au régime autoritarien que c'est inacceptable de menacer les citoyens canadiens ici au Canada. Je pense que j'espère que c'est une victoire pour tous les Canadiens dans les communautés ethno-culturelles.
Mais ça a pris du temps avant que le gouvernement prenne cette décision d'expulser M. Wei Zhou. Vous pensez quoi du fait que
Je pense que ça fait trop de temps. Je pense que c'est une décision que le gouvernement doit faire il y a 2 ans et il y a 5 ans. Moi, ce n'est pas le seul cas ici au Canada avec l'ingérence étrangère. Il y a beaucoup d'histoires devant les comités parlementaires, dans beaucoup d'histoires dans les médias qui ont...
Pour vous, personnellement, le fait que ça ait pris tant de temps que ça, quel effet ça a pu avoir sur vous et votre famille?
Je pense que ça crée un risque pour moi et ma famille parce qu'il y a quelqu'un ici au Canada pendant les dernières 2 ans qui a fait une cible à moi et ma famille ici au Canada. Et pour moi, ça augmente le risque beaucoup parce que j'ai aucune idée.
On that front, have you spoken to your family in Hong Kong since this came out, and how are they doing, and how is your family here doing?
My family here is okay. My family in Hong Kong, I've not had communications with, and I think this is an important point for to be known. There are Canadians across the country who deliberately have cut off contact and communication with families in authoritarian states out of an abundance of caution to protect those families. And so, frankly, I don't know what's happened, if anything, to them, because we, out of an abundance of caution, have cut off communication.
In French, you just said you thought that the time it took increased the risk. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I frequently have meetings in Toronto. For example, I often go to the University of Toronto campus, the St. George campus, to meet with experts on various matters of policy. That's a mere 2 or 3 blocks from the PRC consulate on St. George Street. And to know, to go to those meetings in such close proximity to an individual who is actively trying to gather information to target my family and the PRC is disconcerting not to have known that.
Right, I'm sorry, I'm trying to clarify. I understood you to say in French that the time it took the government to come to this decision about expelling the diplomat somehow increased the risk to you or your family. I was trying to understand that point.
Well, precisely because the government knew some time ago that Mr. Wei Zhou, operating out of the PRC consulate on St. George Street and Bernard Street in Toronto, was gathering information on Canadian soil about me and my family in order to further target and intimidate me. And so I was unaware that this individual was at that location working to do that. I often frequent that area of the country. I take meetings at the University of Toronto with policy experts at the Monk School, at other parts of the university, and to realize in retrospect that that individual could have been monitoring what was going on, what I was doing, is very disconcerting. And to know that the Government of Canada knew that and failed to inform me about this individual is equally disconcerting.
A public figure that's been impacted. Do you know of any other individuals who have been targeted by Mr. Wei Zhou? You mentioned, you gave other examples. Are there other parliamentarians, other politicians? I'm looking at photos right now. I see him interacting with Mayor John Tory. Do you know any information? Have you been given any information in regards to that?
Well, I've been told by former colleague Bob Soroya that he received inappropriate communications from the PRC consulate on St. George Street in Toronto. I've heard firsthand accounts from Canadians in the Lower Mainland of Vancouver of being targeted by PRC officials. So yeah, it's not the first time I've heard this, no.
But this individual primarily, specifically this individual?
I've not heard anything prior to last Monday's account in the Globe and Mail.
This expulsion, is there anything else you'd like to see the federal government do? Is there anything else you expect them to do?
Yes, experts have been telling us for years that we need a foreign agents registry put in place. Experts have been telling us that the RCMP needs to better coordinate with CSIS in order to ensure the prosecution, arrest, and charges being laid against individuals engaged in these activities. We need to indicate immediately to authorities that the police stations should be shut down. They should have been shut down a long time ago. All these things need to be done immediately. These are things we've been, and experts have been long calling for.
Les risques de représailles en français, les risques de représailles après l'expulsion, est-ce qu'ils sont à considérer? Est-ce que vous craignez ces risques-là? De la Chine, peut-être.
Pendant les dernières 2 ans?
Maintenant que le diplomate est expulsé,
Oui.
est-ce qu'il y a un risque pour notre économie, pour la sécurité de Canadiens en Chine, tout ça? Est-ce que ça doit être pris en considération? Et est-ce que c'est inquiétant en ce moment?
Je pense que le plus grand risque que le Canada a maintenant, et c'est la même chose pour les autres démocraties pendant le monde, et c'est le risque contre nos valeurs fondamentaux. C'est clair pendant la dernière décennie que les régimes, le modèle autoritarien, attaquent les valeurs de nos démocraties, les valeurs qui sont basées sur les droits humains, que un principe sur les institutions démocratiques, qui est basé sur le principe de la loi et l'indépendance de notre judiciaire. C'est les principes fondamentaux de toutes les démocraties ici au Canada et ailleurs. Et c'est dans ce contexte, c'est absolument essentiel que le gouvernement du Canada défend ces valeurs. Sinon, toutes les autres choses, la prospérité, l'économie, ça va disparaître. Ça va être disparu. Et c'est clair, c'est la vie. I'll say this in English because I'll say this more clearly. Nothing is more important in the current context than defending our values. In the context of the last decade, it's clear the authoritarian model of governance is gaining traction around the world. And it is a direct attack on the fundamental principles of freedom, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law that all democracies are based on. And we have to defend these fundamental values. And it is clear that everything else that we have come to enjoy, our economic prosperity, our economic growth, our social cohesion, is based on these foundational values. And that's why security services like CSIS have explicitly said this. They've said that foreign interference threat activities is a national and serious threat that undermines those things. And that's why we have to defend those values, defend democratic institutions, defend the rights, the safety, and security of Canadians here at home as our first principle when approaching these threat activities.
This
is a final question,
On
and then I have to go.
retaliation, on
Yes.
the kind of retaliation you think Canadians should expect now, what do you expect?
Well, I'm not going to speculate what else will come. What I will say is this. This decision to expel a diplomat should have taken place years ago. The fact is we've become somewhat of a playground for foreign interference threat activities, whether it comes in the form of intimidating diaspora communities in the Lower Mainland or in the GTA, whether it comes in the form of targeting MPs and their families, whether it comes in the form of targeting students who are advocating for human rights at the University of Toronto or McMaster University. This has gone on for years, and it's clear from reports that we've received that we have become particularly susceptible to this because the Government of Canada hasn't previously taken action. So my hope is that this sends a clear message to authoritarian states that these kinds of activities are completely incompatible with being a diplomat in this country, and that it actually leads to the diminishment of these activities on Canadian soil.
Would the government have done
Thank you.
Would the government have done this